Good day, my fellow watch brethren. We are writing the year 1917, and above all, time is of the essence, folks. So as a gentleman of the hour, we are eager to present to you the latest masterpiece of watchmaking, brought forth by Zenith, a marvel of engineering.
Enough with my old TiME radio impressions that never happened. But this watch is, in fact, over 100 years old. I don't know about you, but the very thought gives me goosebumps. This watch is 3 times my own age, was produced during the First World War and lived through the Second one, just to end up in my collection and in a YouTube watch review. Crazy, right? Let's try and do it justice. My name is Jan, and you're watching the TiME channel. You all know Zenith as it is known today, part of the LVMH group since 1999, with their famous Defy, Chronomaster and Pilot lines. Even before, they are very well known for the Primero, which was the world's first announced prototype of an automatic chronograph in January 1969. But considering the serial production, Seiko won that race quite clearly, but that's a whole story of its own. But this watch right here brings us to the earliest of chapters for the brand, which was founded in 1865 by Georges Favre-Jacot in Le Locle, Switzerland. It was initially named Fabriques de Billodes, and according to the official story, the name we all know was introduced in 1911, after the founder finished a particularly well-working movement and gazed up to the sky. The celestial mechanics reminded him of the interplay of wheels inside a watch movement, and a new name was born, which represents the highest point of the universe, Zenith. Quite the story. Before heading into the details, I want to address the term trench watch, often found in offerings for World War I era watches like this one. I personally would not call it that, because a true wristwatch meant for frontline trench application typically possessed a loomed dial, fixed wire lugs, an unbreakable crystal, more on that later, and a certain minimum size. Smaller watches below 30mm were most likely women's watches from the time, so no chances of them being proper trench watches. But this watch right here ticked nearly all the boxes to be a trench watch, aside from the loomed dial and the completely fixed lugs. It is also on the largest side of things, with 39mm in diameter without the crown, considering typical wristwatches of the time or trench watches were around 35mm. It's 43mm from lug to lug, and the height on this one comes mainly from the crystal, adding up to 13.7mm in total. The acrylic crystal on top is of course a replacement, which was added later, but typical trench watches of that time already focused on and marketed unbreakable crystals, which were cellulose acetates or celluloid, so basically bioplastics. They would not shatter like a mineral glass, so they got that going for them when used in the trenches, but they were quite temperature sensitive and aged rather quickly, turning yellow over time, in comparison to modern acrylic crystals. Anyway, the acrylic on this one is heavily domed, adding a very nice distortion to the dial when viewed at an angle. If you happen to actually own a watch with a celluloid crystal, please refrain from polishing it with polywatch or the likes. That will probably ruin it for good. Just a small disclaimer. About the case material itself, it is made of sterling silver, so 92.5 silver content in the alloy, which renders this watch quite light, coming in at 56 grams in total with the strap, but it also makes it quite susceptible to scratches. But a bit of polishing makes it shine quite nicely again. It came on a lizard leather strap with 13mm lug width here on these hinged lugs, but unfortunately one of the loops ripped off, so I exchanged it. Since the wire lugs are fixed and have no spring bars, the old strap was stapled shut. Therefore I had to cut it off to exchange it. Fortunately, there are aftermarket leather straps out there which have an open loop to wrap around the fixed lugs, making the whole exchange quite easy. About the dial, it is made of white enamel and features some hairlines on it. It is also a little bit chipped here at the center, but still in great condition considering its age. The numerals all around are burned into the enamel, vitreous enamel that is called. At least that is my perception since I'm no expert, but if they were painted on afterwards I would expect them to be a little bit raised above the dial, which is not the case. The red, or sometimes blue, 12 is something you can typically see on World War I watches. The reason for that was simple, and it is a remnant from when pocket watches were strapped to the wrist for the first time. The 12 on the older open-faced pocket watches was aligned with the crown and the sub-seconds. But to wear a watch on the wrist, a savonette layout was more favorable, where the crown is at the 3 o'clock position and the sub-seconds and 12 therefore perpendicular to the crown. But those hunter watches used to have a metal lid on them and required to be operated with 2 hands, which would not be very practical as a wristwatch. So these savonette movements were put into an open-face Lepine case to create the perfect layout for a wristwatch. In order to avoid confusion, since everyone was used to the Lepine layout, a red or blue 12 would immediately help with the orientation. That's an info that I got from vintagewatchstraps.com, which is maybe not an official explanation, but it makes perfect sense in my opinion. The hands on it are spade-shaped and have a nice blue hue when the light hits them at the correct angle. A very classical look. The caseback does not offer much aside from the full sterling silver, which gets a little bit dull due to the contact with the wrist. But what is more interesting is the double hinged lid back here, which lets you access the movement quite easily. Underneath, there's a second lid, and on the inside, a beautiful Zenith logo of the starry sky, and that second lid is a little bit more securely attached. Popping it open reveals the manual wind 16 linie or 36.1mm Zenith movement underneath, beating away at 18,000 amplitudes per hour, which has a beautiful sound to it. A thing of beauty in my opinion. The watch was initially offered for 1,600 euros without box or papers from a very reputable dealer, but there was fortunately some room for negotiation left. It's difficult to price these in general, since there are not a lot of comparable pieces online. It definitely depends on their condition, age, and general appeal to collectors. There are definitely cheaper options from lesser known brands of the time, but also more sought after pieces, especially if it's a proper trench watch. I immediately fell for this one, and I knew it would be the perfect fit and gift for my wife. A 100-year-old watch is not what you see every day, especially from such a well-known and still existing brand like Zenith. With this piece, I wanted to provide you with a bit of insight into that fascinating era when pocket watches were transformed into practical wrist companions. I hope you enjoyed this quick episode and maybe found yourself intrigued to look up one of these older gems. See you in the next one.